Hello, everyone. My name is Yves Massard, and today, as part of Authenticate 2021, we're going to talk about how supply chain customer can limit their exposure to data breaches. So first, let's define what is supply chain. Supply chain is organization that work with each other in order to be able to deliver goods or services. And any organization that's part of that supply chain is by definition part of the supply chain. So organization could be organization that focus on providing goods like finished goods or components or raw materials, IoT devices. That one I highlight because there's obvious implication in terms of the customer IT system. Services as well could be things like catering, security, marketing or advertising, HR, outsourcing, any kind of services that might be provided. And then as well, IT services and software. Those I also highlight separately because they obviously have a very important impact on the IT ecosystem of the customer who implement and deploys those IT services and software. So this might be cloud service vendors. It could be software vendor that provide their software to be installed on premise at the customer. Might be also open source software. It's things that sometimes people don't really think about supply chain, but it's definitely part of the supply chain. When you take open source software and you start using it as part of your IT ecosystem or maybe as part of the product or services that you're building, open source definitely becomes part of your supply chain. And it's often nowadays a large amount of open source components that are being incorporated into the supply chain. And then also the IT professional services that might be doing some work on your IT system, some consulting work, and so on. Who are the supply chain customers? So those would be the people that could be affected by a supply chain attack, and it really is across the whole gamut from a corporation, whether they're public, private, or limited partnership, governments, national government, local and state, also quasi-government organization. There's quite a few of those as well. Those are organizations that may not be governmental, but are controlled by governments, and also the non-governmental organization as well, whether they're local, national, or international. All those organizations might be a target of a supply chain attack because most of those do have a supply chain that they rely on in order to be able to provide the goods or the services that they provide to their community. So what are the security risks that might come from the supply chain? Here, I thought the easiest might be to pick a few examples that would really make it relatable. There's many more than just those. Those are, some examples that are well known and that you probably have heard about in the news. So, for example, we've got Target, the retailer that several years ago was compromised. The attack came from an HVAC vendor. So Target, like many organizations, might rely on a vendor to be able to service their air conditioning systems. And that particular vendor had a remote access, a password, an account, a remote that he used with a password to remotely access the HVAC system that Target uses. And once that vendor was in, essentially the vendor had access to the rest of or a large portion of the network, the corporate network that Target uses. So the attacker actually compromised the vendor, was able to get access to the password of that vendor, and use that access to remotely connect to the IT system of Target, and from there was able to compromise around 40 million of credit and debit cards. Was a major hack, and the Target response cost a quarter after the attack was 61 million, and you can imagine that cost continued increasing afterward. So the attacker, by being able to target the vendor, the HVAC vendor, was able then to burrow into target IT system and then make their way to the credit card and debit card that were stored in the financial system of target. So that can show you that such an attack can come from a corner that you would not expect, and that can really have very wide-ranging issues. The dollar amount is quite significant, but it's not just that, it's also the reputational cost that also can be a major problem. Another example of a supply chain risk is the NotPetya MEDoc attack. So NotPetya was an attack that infected the financial software MEDoc. That financial software was actually used by a lot of critical infrastructure in Ukraine, and so the attacker, likely a state organization, used the financial software from MEDoc to be able to make their way into the critical infrastructure of many Ukraine organizations. As a side effect, that attack actually affected other people, kind of like a virus. So it had a larger impact than just that, but it again shows how a vendor here, a financial software, was used to be the bridge to be able to access the systems of the critical infrastructure organization. The last example I'm going to pick is SolarWinds. You probably heard about that attack about a year and a half ago. SolarWinds is an IT vendor that provides management software for IT networks. That's widely used. Essentially what happened is the SolarWinds corporation was hacked, and the hacker then used their access to actually incorporate hacking tools inside SolarWinds product, and SolarWinds product were then deployed in their customer environment. So the attack affected more than 18,000 customers, so it's a very large attack. It seems like the attack was mostly active around 150 targets. Most of them were US federal government customers or contractors, but you can see how the attacked one vendor and then affected a very large amount of organization all across the world. Here also, it was likely a state actor that perpetrated that attack. But you can see that the kind of threat actor that do those kind of attacks can vary. It's not just an espionage type of attack, but it can also be an economic type of attack where somebody is trying to steal something for an economical purpose. So it's not just state actors, but it can also be rogue hackers, rogue group of hackers also trying to do those kind of attacks. So is a supply chain attack really different from the other attacks that you might hear? It is a little bit, in the sense that the initial attack vector will come from the supply chain. So you as an organization, you might be thinking about, shoring up your defenses, doing all the best practice that you've been hearing about. But if you just think about your internal employees or maybe your close contractors, you might be missing the mark. You're definitely doing the right thing, but you have to make sure that you expand your horizon a little bit wider, or you might fall under a supply chain attack. Because what happens typically is that when you raise your defenses, and for whatever reason, if you are a potential target that's attractive to an attacker, well, that attacker is going to look where you might have weaknesses. And if you raise your defenses, your weaknesses might very well be in your supply chain. And you have to think about also it's a chain, right? So it might be your direct vendors, or it might be a vendor of your vendor, right? And so when you're thinking about protecting your IT system, protecting your data, you really have to think about that holistically, not just your employees and your direct contractor that might be on your premises, but also who do you do business with, and where might you be producing services, software, IoT devices that might then be used as an attack vector against your system. What happens is typically once the initial attack is done and the attacker managed to make their way inside your system, then like with many other attacks, they would do a subsequent lateral move so that they can then target the actual information or system that they want to compromise. So after the initial attack, it very much looked like a regular attack, like you would get with spear phishing or any other kind of attack. But the initial vector, what's special about supply chain attack is it might be coming from somebody that's in your supply chain that either might have access to your system for a specific reason, like for example, the example with the HVAC vendor, might be providing you software or IoT devices or cloud services that might be that you might use either in your IT system or might be incorporated into your products. And from there, they're able to continue the attack and expand it and get to their real target. So how could you how could you mitigate a supply chain attack? So there's there's a lot of ways you could do that. I'm going to go over a few areas. It's by no means 100% complete, but it's a good starting point. I just want to make a note too that this really applies to both the customers that want to protect themselves against a supply chain attack, but it also applies to vendors as well. Because those vendors also really have to think about, when they provide a good or a services, would they in any way be a way for an attacker to make their way into their customers? That's something that as a vendor you might want to think about, because you definitely want to be the one that put a breach to your customers, right? And you also have to think about in your own supply chain how that might be how you might be affected by them, which might in turn affect your customers, right? So it's really something a little bit recursive in a way. So there's a few categories that I would like to stress out. One is cataloging the supply chain and looking at the potential threat that might come from that. Assess the supply chain security maturity. Implement zero trust so that you can really shore up your defenses and prevent lateral moves. Implement proper configuration and change management, as well as monitoring and vulnerability management, and also look at physical security, which might be an attack vector as well. So let's go a little bit deeper into each of those items. So first, let's look at cataloging and assessing the supply chain. So the first thing, if you want to be protected, is to be aware of where the threat might be coming. And so if you don't really know what your supply chain is, whether it's good services or IT vendors, you're not going to really be able to think about where the threats might be coming from. So it's really important to be able to take a catalog and then to perform a threat analysis to understand the potential risk. If what you're supplying from a vendor is raw material, well, the risk there might be limited. But if you're supplying is a service, and as part of that service, you're providing maybe an account to your access to your IT system, where that contractor get access to your IT system, you probably want to look at that a little bit closer. Similarly, if you're procuring an IoT device that you're going to put into your network, well, you probably want to look at that more than if you're just, buying aluminum or if you're buying some screws or whatever things that you might be buying that might not have much impact into your ecosystem. So here it's really about risk management, understanding where the risk might be coming from, what's the likelihood of that. You're probably not going to be able to do that everywhere, right? And that's where doing the threat analysis, looking at the likelihood of an issue is important, and is going to help you focus really where you want to focus in terms of your attention, and if in terms of mitigating the kind of attacks you might run into. Once you know your supply chain, your threats and all of that, then you probably want to pick a number of suppliers. You would want to start with the ones where you might have the biggest risk, and assess the security maturity of your supply chain. You would probably not do that for everyone, but for the ones that are the most important to start with, you would want to go to your vendor and try to understand how much they take those kind of risks seriously, and what kind of vulnerability they might leave you open to. So CISA, the cybersecurity agency, part of DHS in the US, has a vendor supply chain risk management template that you might want to take a look, and you might want to use that or use part of that to go back to your vendors and ask them those kind of questions, so that you can get a good sense of does that vendor has tech security seriously? Are there areas that you might want to shore up working proactively with that vendor, or maybe decide that maybe you need to switch vendor if that vendor is not taking those kind of areas seriously. Another thing that's going to be very beneficial to your IT system and to your production system is looking at implementing zero trust. And now that's a little bit more bread and butter to what Authenticate does, right? But it's definitely something that's very important. So when you think about supply chain or cyber attacks in general, you want to be prepared, but you also want to know that at some point there's a good chance that you might be breached. The breach might not be big, it might not last long, but an attacker just needs to defeat your defenses only once when you try to protect yourself 100% of the time. And you have to recognize that no matter how good you are, there's going to be a slip up. There might be a 0-day attack. Whatever it might be, something might happen where you get breached. By implementing zero trust, you're going to limit the risk that comes from those breaches and provide a lot of mitigation. Zero trust, one of the tenets of zero trust is to deny access by default, and that's going to help you against an attack, especially when the attacker tries to move laterally. If he doesn't have access to things with the account of let's say the HVAC vendor, and the HVAC vendor, and he needs access from an account from financial or from IT, that's going to make the life of the attacker harder. Similarly, another tenet is to segment network. That's going to also help you limit exposure. So, for example, if the attacker from the HVAC vendor only has access to a sub-network that serves the systems that are connected to the HVAC system, and it doesn't have any visibility into the financial system, into the other back offices system, then you're going to make it harder for the attacker to move laterally and go to their intended target. Another very strong, important point is to implement strong identity so that the access is only provided to the proper person. And that's really where MFA, multi-factor authentication methods like FIDO will really help you make sure that things here is strong, right? So if you require a strong identity and you verify that identity, it's going to make it harder for the attacker to, again, move laterally, maybe move from the account from the vendor to maybe an IT or a financial or whatever is the target. That's going to help prevent that. And if you use multi-factor authentication like FIDO, that's going to make it very difficult. As we know, even to these days, passwords are still part of 75-80% of the breaches that are out there. So moving to something like FIDO is really going to shore up your defenses and really going to prevent an attacker to jump from one account to the other until they get to where they need. Also, I would also highlight that authentication is important, but you also want to have identification as well, and making sure that you provide strong authentication to the right person by having identity is also important, because if you just have authentication, but you didn't make sure that the authentication is to the right person, then that could still be a way for an attacker to make their way, try to make you think that you gave the strong authentication to the right person, and then they can do whatever they want. So authentication is very important. Identity proofing ahead of providing the authentication method is also something you want to consider. Configuration and change management is also very important, both preventing and for forensic and remediation. From a preventing standpoint, because you would know what a secure configuration is, you would be able to know what is a good known state, control the software update and the configuration change. And if an attack happens and you move into a forensic mode, if you already have that strong configuration and change management, then it makes it easier to go back to a good known state. It makes it easier to detect unauthorized changes if you look for those kind of things, and discover, what changed and when, and then it helps you have a better likelihood to limit the scope of the attack to maybe a subsystem, and then when it's time to clean up things, also limit the amount of work you need to do to bring back your overall system into a trustworthy state. Monitoring and vulnerability management is also a big part of that. We already talked about how you should assume that you will be breached at some point, and having that monitoring part of that to be able to detect a breach is very important. When you do the work of deploying zero trust and MFA, that also actually can help you in doing the work of detecting suspicious behavior, because quite often when you deploy zero trust, you're doing the work already of determining what is not suspicious, what should be allowed, and by extension of that, anything that's outside of that would be marked as suspicious, and you can monitor specifically on that, or rather raise more alarm when you see a behavior that's there when you do your monitoring. So you can see how all those different things work together, right? Zero trust helps you define what's good, what's allowed, and you want to enforce that. But once you define that, then you can know if that changes, then you can flag that, and then if you flag that, then you want to immediately maybe put that in a different part of your network so that it can be segregated, and you can also start alerting right away, so you can do a forensic on this and limit any risk that could be here. So vulnerability management is also very important. That's a basic best practice that you've probably heard for quite a long time, but being up to speed on what are the non-vulnerabilities on the software and hardware that you're using is quite important, and you want to get on top of it to be able to apply updates or decommission what cannot be updated, so that again you limit your surface of attack, and somebody that comes from a supply chain attack then cannot use non-vulnerabilities to then do a lateral move and expand further into your network and your application. So that's also very important. Physical security. So physical security, when you think about cybersecurity, often people don't always think about it, but it's still an attack vector, and it might be one way that you get attacked that then get expanded differently. And I would also note that often, if you look at regulatory mandates, they will often talk about the physical aspect, not just about the IT aspect. There's a couple reasons for that. One, if somebody gets physical access to, let's say, your data center, well, it makes it a lot easier for them to tamper with the hardware that your IT system runs on it. And if they tamper with that hardware system, then they can do a lot of damage right there. And so having strong physical security, if you're concerned about your IT security, is definitely a prerequisite. In addition to that, some of those mandates also look at confidential data and how to protect them. And that data may often, most likely, reside in your IT system, but it may also reside outside of your IT system. It might be printed and so on. And so if you're concerned about data access, definitely looking at physical security is something that you want to take a look at. And I would say here, zero trust principle should be applied there as well. Thinking about least privilege, deny access unless there is a need, knowing who's coming, not just a generic identity, but really knowing who's coming, maybe with some badging system or some other way, is definitely something you want to think about. And then going back to IT systems, if you deploy a converged identity that span both IT and physical, this will help you limit risk because you'll be able to implement policies that look at onboarding and offboarding those identities, both on the IT and the physical side. If they're not silo, but if they're converged, you're more likely to be able to decommission access on both sides instead of maybe you turn off IT access, but physical access is still there, or vice versa. So having that converged identity will help shore up your overall security. So I thought I would conclude this presentation with looking at supply chain mandates and regulation that are out there. That's an area that's you can expect to change and evolve as we go forward. But I'll pick a few examples. So first, there's NERC CIP 013-1. This one is focused around the electrical system in the US, the energy system in the US. Another one is NIST SP 800-1-161. That one is focused around federal agencies when they look at their supply chain and provide a lot of recommendation and best practice, how to determine the risk and assess the supply chain. In the UK, the National Cybersecurity Center has a supply chain security guidance. It's not a mandate, but it provides guidance on how to look at your supply chain. Going back to the US, the National Institute of Science and Technology have a special publication titled 800-171, which provide best practice for securing confidential information provided to government vendors. So here you are more likely to fall under that mandate today. If you are a defense contractor, that would fall under the federal acquisition rule. However, this will likely get expanded to the overall supply chain, to the federal government, if the supply chain is given access to confidential information. And there's a lot of very good best practice that are listed there. After that, more recently, the DoD created the CMMC Cybersecurity Maturity Model. It's built on top of 800-171, but it goes beyond. And there's a few things. First, 171 was mandated, but essentially, if you're a vendor, when you contract with the government, you essentially check a box saying that you apply, but the government really didn't know whether you actually implemented what's in 800-171. So with CMMC, there's going to be a mandatory certification, which means that you as a vendor will have to go through that. It's going to be done through an independent certified auditor. It also has more focus around processes. 171 was really focused around threats and defenses, but here it also will look at processes and the life cycle of those processes. In addition of that, CMMC also recognized that not everybody has the same risk profile. 171 was a little bit one size fits all because it was so focused around confidential information. CMMC expands that to more than just confidential information, and so vendors might be, somebody that comes to an RB base to model on, for example. You're not going to expect that vendor to have the same kind of cybersecurity risk or systems as you would from somebody that's servicing the IT system of I don't know, the Air Force. So here it provides a little bit more flexibility in terms of defining risk profiles. And so if you are a customer that wants to assess your supply chain and you want to look at what's best practice, it can give you some ideas there, and it really shows you that it's not one size fits all, but you gotta tailor the kind of assessment you might be doing on your supply chain, depending on the risk that they might be bringing to your organization. And then finally, DHS CISA is starting to look at implementing critical infrastructure performance goal. So that would fall under the critical infrastructure. It's being built with NIST and it's being built now. So I would expect that over time, this might turn into mandates as well. But for now, it highlights goals and areas that you might want to focus on. So as you can see, it's an area that's changing a lot. Supply chain attacks have been going on for quite a while, for probably more than 10, 15 years, maybe even longer, likely even longer. But the first one that I can think of, they go as that were publicized and reported in the news they go back more than 15 years, definitely. But we certainly have seen an acceleration of that in the past few years, and you can expect that there will be more. As the organization shore up their defenses, the attack will move to the supply chain more and more. And so I hope that with this session, I provided you with a few areas to look for in terms on how to protect yourself, protect your customers if you're part of the supply chain, and then look at your supply chain vendors and ask them the right question and assess the risk that might be coming from them. So with that, I thank you very much, and I wish you a great day.